The town of Redemption sat crouched against the desert like an animal that had forgotten how to breathe. It was a scatter of weather-beaten buildings half sunk in dust, their paint long since peeled by wind and sun. The main street stretched between two dry gulches, where even the tumbleweeds seemed too tired to roll. A single church bell, cracked and reluctant, hung in the rafters of the chapel that had not yet heard a full congregation. Into this weary place came Reverend Nathaniel Cole, riding a mule-drawn wagon beside his daughter Grace. The girl was 17, though her eyes looked older, soft gray beneath the wide brim of her bonnet, steady with the quiet endurance of someone who'd seen too much road and too little kindness. They had left Missouri 3 months ago, chasing a calling that her father swore was divine. Grace wasn't so sure. The sun was a living weight overhead when they arrived. The preacher dismounted stiffly, brushing the dust from his long black coat. His Bible, bound in cracked leather, swung from one hand like a weapon of righteousness. Grace climbed down after him, her dress clinging to her from the heat, her boots sinking into the powdery street. She could feel the stares of men through the slatted windows of the saloon and the blacksmith shop. Redemption was not used to strangers, especially not the kind that came preaching heaven in a place that already looked like hell. "God led us here, child," the preacher said, surveying the broken town as though it were a battlefield waiting for a sermon. "We will bring light to these people." Grace nodded, though she wasn't sure light could live here. The air smelled of old whiskey, horse sweat, and scorched earth. Somewhere down the street, a hammer struck iron in a slow, rhythmless beat, metal being shaped by will alone. Inside the saloon, the town's few regulars turned their heads as the preacher stepped through the batwing doors. Grace lingered outside, watching the horizon where the desert shimmered in waves of heat. She imagined what lay beyond it: tribal lands, mountains that cut the sky, and the whispered stories she'd heard of the Apache who roamed those canyons like ghosts. A voice behind her startled her. "You best keep close to your pa, miss." It was the blacksmith, a heavy man with soot on his arms. "Ain't safe for a pretty girl to wander here. There's things out in those hills that don't take kindly to our kind." Grace thanked him politely, though she didn't like the way his eyes lingered. She turned back toward the wagon. Her father emerged from the saloon after a long while, his face flushed with the satisfaction of conviction. "We'll hold service come Sunday," he announced. "They may drink and curse, but their souls still belong to the Lord." That night, as the town folded into the long silence of dusk, Grace sat by the window of the shack they'd rented. The desert stretched beyond, vast and indifferent. Somewhere out there a coyote called, lonely, distant, eternal. She watched the stars begin to scatter across the sky like spilled salt. For the first time she felt the strange pull of the land, a wildness she could neither name nor resist. It frightened her and thrilled her all at once. The preacher prayed aloud in the other room, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of an old hymn. Grace closed her eyes, trying to believe in the same faith that carried him across half a continent. But something deep inside whispered that the world was larger than her father's sermons, more dangerous and perhaps more beautiful. In the coming days, she would learn just how right that whisper was. Morning came on slow, spilling gold over the desert ridges like a promise that wouldn't keep. Grace rose before the town did. Her father was still asleep, his Bible spread open beside him, a candle guttered to a pool of wax. She slipped quietly outside, her skirts brushing against the threshold as though afraid to wake the world. The air was sharp and cool, filled with the smell of dust and sage. She walked toward the edge of town where the desert began in earnest, that endless, shimmering plain where only the desperate or the holy dared to wander. She carried a tin pail to fetch water from the spring that pooled a mile beyond the ridge. Her father had warned her not to go alone, but she had grown used to the rhythm of solitude. There was a peace out there that Redemption didn't have, a silence that felt more like listening than emptiness. The spring lay in a shallow basin of rock, half hidden by scrub. Grace knelt, dipped the pail, and watched the ripples break the surface. The sun had begun its climb, and already the air trembled with heat. She brushed a strand of hair from her face, her bonnet discarded beside her boots. Then she heard it. A low sound, somewhere between a sigh and a growl. She froze, her pulse quickening. The desert could play tricks with sound, bending echoes across miles of emptiness. But this was close. Too close. Grace turned slowly. A figure stood at the edge of the basin, tall, motionless, watching. He was a man, though for a moment she doubted it. His shoulders were broad as a barn door, his skin the color of weathered copper. His hair hung long, black as raven's wings and tied with a strip of hide. Across his chest were scars that looked old as the land itself. He held no weapon, yet something in the way he stood made her breath catch, as though the earth itself answered to him. She had heard the townsfolk whisper of the giant of Apache Ridge, a warrior who moved like wind through the canyons unseen but always felt. Some said he was a spirit, some said he was a man who'd killed too many to die. Now he was here. For a long moment neither moved. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath. Grace tried to speak, but her voice failed. She clutched the pail like a shield. The man's gaze fell on it, then on her. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward and pointed to the water. She hesitated, then nodded. He knelt beside her, cupped his hands, and drank deeply. The sound of it, water touching cracked lips, seemed almost sacred. When he finished, he looked at her again, eyes dark and clear as obsidian. "You should not be here," he said, his English rough but careful. Grace found her voice at last. "It's just water." He shook his head. "Water is life. Life is not safe." The words sent a shiver through her, not from fear, but from something older. An instinct, a recognition. She wanted to ask his name, but before she could, the distant echo of gunfire cracked across the plain. The man stiffened, listening. Without another word, he rose to his full height, towering over her, and turned toward the sound. Then he was gone. One blink, and he had vanished into the desert heat, as if the land itself had swallowed him. Grace stood for a long time, the pail trembling in her hands. The sun climbed higher, bleaching the sky white. She knew she should return before her father woke, but her heart beat with a strange, fierce rhythm that made the town feel suddenly small and far away. As she walked back toward redemption, she looked once over her shoulder. There was nothing there but heat haze and sand, yet she felt eyes on her still, the eyes of the giant she had just met, and the world beyond her father's sermons calling her name. 3 days passed before Grace saw him again. In that time, redemption had grown restless. Word had come from a passing rider that a ranch north of the river had been raided. 3 men dead, 2 missing, cattle scattered across the flats. The sheriff claimed it was Apaches. The saloon agreed before he'd even finished saying it. By sundown, the town's fear had turned to hatred. Grace heard the talk through the open window of their rented shack, rough voices thick with whiskey and certainty. She watched the glow of lanterns flicker against the dust like small angry stars. Her father stood at the table, his hands resting on the good book, his knuckles white. "These people are heathens," he said. Not to her, but to the Lord he thought was listening. "The devil hides in their hearts, and it's our duty to drive him out." Grace sat quietly in the corner, sewing a tear in her dress. She didn't answer. She had seen the devil in men before, but he had spoken English and worn a badge. When night fell, she slipped outside again, her needlework forgotten. The air was heavy with smoke from the saloon lamps. The desert beyond the last line of buildings called to her like a voice under her skin. She didn't mean to go far, just far enough to breathe without the weight of the town pressing down. She followed the dry creek bed that wound like a scar through the flats, her lantern bobbing beside her. The moon was thin, silver, and sharp-edged. Then she heard it again. The same low sound she'd heard at the spring, a soft rumble, almost human, almost not. She stopped. Her pulse leapt. A shape emerged from the dark, moving between the rocks. It was him, Tawa. The giant stepped into the circle of her lantern light, and she saw him clearly for the first time. He was not as she had imagined from rumor. No savage demon of the frontier, but a man of flesh and bone, scarred by the desert and proud of it. His eyes were steady, the kind that had seen death and didn't flinch from it. "You should not walk here," he said again, his voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. Grace swallowed. "You said that before." He gave a slight nod, almost a smile. "You did not listen." She didn't know what to say. The light trembled in her hand, throwing gold across his face. "They say your people attacked a ranch," she said softly. "Is it true?" Tawa's expression hardened. "No." The word was final, like a door shutting. "There are men who wear Apache skins," he added after a pause. "They do this to make war between us. The White Town believes what it wants to believe. Grace lowered her lantern. I don't want to believe lies. Then see for yourself, he said. She didn't understand what he meant. But before she could ask, a sharp sound cracked through the night. A rifle shot. Then another. The lantern shattered as she dropped it. Fire hissed in the sand. Tawa moved faster than she could follow. One moment beside her, the next pulling her down behind a boulder as bullets whined past. Stay down, he said, his voice low and calm. In the distance, men shouted, drunken, angry voices calling her name. Her father's name, Tawa, one yelled. We know you're out there. Grace's heart pounded. She could see the silhouettes of men on horseback, rifles glinting in the moonlight. Her father's flock had turned into a mob. Tawa crouched beside her, silent as stone. When the gunfire paused, he whispered, Go back to your people. Tell them the desert doesn't forget lies. He rose, melting into the darkness before she could stop him. Within seconds, he was gone. Nothing left but the echo of his words and the smell of burnt oil from the lantern. Grace stumbled home through the dark, her dress torn, her hands shaking. Behind her, the desert whispered and the wind carried the faintest trace of a voice she couldn't tell was prayer or warning. The next morning, redemption woke to rumors that ran faster than the wind. Someone swore they'd seen Apache scouts near the riverbed. Someone else said a rancher's wife had been taken. By noon, the saloon was full and the sheriff's voice was drowned beneath the roar of men who'd already decided who to blame. Savages, they spat, pounding the bar with their fists. It's them again. Always them. Grace watched from across the street, standing by the window of the chapel her father had claimed as his pulpit. The men's shouts drifted out into the dust and heat, the sound like a fever spreading. Her father stood beside her, his face grim and set. It begins, he said softly, though there was a strange light in his eyes, half fear, half fervor. The Lord tests his flock with danger, child, but the faithful must not tremble. Grace looked at him, trying to read his meaning. You think this is God's doing? I think all things are God's doing, he answered, turning back to the pulpit. Even the sword that strikes us. Even the fire that purifies. He began to prepare for Sunday's sermon, though the pews were still empty and the town's faith ran thinner than its whiskey. Grace went to fetch water again that afternoon, though she dared not go near the spring where she had met Tawa. She took the path behind the chapel, where a small trough stood half full. The air was thick with the smell of iron and sweat. From the livery stable nearby came the sound of hammering, horseshoes, nails, the hard rhythm of men preparing for something. The blacksmith glanced up as she passed. Your pa's got folks stirred, he said, not unkindly. Talk as there'll be a posse riding out come nightfall. Why? She asked, though she already knew. 'Cause fear don't sit easy, miss. It's gotta ride somewhere. Grace carried the water back inside, her stomach tight. Her father was practicing his sermon, pacing the floor as he spoke aloud. The Lord said, I will smite the heathen from before thee. His voice rose, echoing through the wooden walls. And I shall raise up a generation of the righteous to do my will. Grace stopped in the doorway, the bucket trembling in her hands. She had heard him preach before, but never like this. There was something hard in his tone, something that didn't sound like faith at all. Father, she said quietly, if you lead them to violence, they'll only bring more upon themselves. He turned to her, eyes bright with conviction. Daughter, do not mistake mercy for weakness. Evil must be cast out. But how do you know who's evil? Her question hung in the air. He didn't answer. That night the men gathered in the street, torches in hand, rifles slung across their backs. The preacher stood among them, his black coat snapping in the wind, the firelight dancing across his face. Grace stood behind him, her heart pounding as she listened to their plans. They would ride east at dawn, to the ridge, to the canyons, to wherever they thought the Apache hid. They said it was to defend the town. Grace knew better. It was vengeance they wanted, not safety. When the meeting ended, the crowd dispersed like a stirred nest of hornets. Grace stayed in the shadows, watching her father speak quietly with the sheriff. She couldn't hear their words, but she saw the way her father's hand rested on his Bible as though it were a gun. Above them, thunder rumbled far off, dry, hollow, the kind that never brings rain. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring toward the black horizon where the desert began. Somewhere out there, Tawa was watching too. She could feel it, the same way she felt the pull of a storm before it broke. The town was turning toward something it couldn't undo, and she knew that when the sun rose, blood would follow it. The dawn came red, the kind of red that stains everything it touches. When Grace stepped outside, the world smelled of gunpowder and dust. The posse had ridden out before sunrise, 10 men on horses, her father among them. She had woken to the echo of hooves fading into the canyon, a trail of firelit clouds chasing them east. Now the town lay empty and waiting, as if it were holding its breath. She tried to go about her chores, fetching water, sweeping the steps of the chapel, but her hands shook too much to hold anything steady. Every sound made her start: the cry of a hawk, the creak of a shutter, the whisper of the wind. By noon, the sky had gone white and still. Then came the thunder of hooves again. Grace ran to the edge of the street just as the first rider appeared, his hat gone, his face streaked with blood and dirt. More followed, limping, wounded, wild-eyed. Behind them came the preacher, his coat torn, his Bible missing. They didn't ride like victors. They rode like men who'd seen hell. The townsfolk poured from their doorways as the riders dismounted. The sheriff staggered forward, shouting for water, for a doctor, for whiskey. But Grace's father said nothing. He just walked past her, eyes distant, hands trembling. "Father, what happened?" Grace called, grabbing his sleeve. He didn't answer. It was the blacksmith who finally spoke, voice hoarse. "We found the rancher's place," he said. "It weren't Apaches. Wasn't even close. Just outlaws, white men dressed in paint and feathers." A murmur swept through the crowd. The preacher turned sharply, his face tightening. "Lies," he said. "They wear the serpent's skin to hide their sin. Do not be deceived." But no one spoke after that. The men only looked away, unwilling to meet each other's eyes. Grace felt the world tilt. She remembered Tawa's words. There are men who wear Apache skins. Later, when the wounded were carried inside and the dust began to settle, she found her father in the chapel. He was on his knees before the pulpit, praying, or trying to. His words came out fractured, half sermon, half plea. "Lord, I led them in your name," he whispered. "If we have done wrong, then it is by your will, not ours." Grace stepped inside quietly. "You knew," she said. He didn't look up. "Knew what?" "That it wasn't them." Silence. Then, "The devil hides in many faces, Grace. You cannot always trust what your eyes see." She felt anger rise in her chest. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "But I can trust what my heart knows. And I know what you did was wrong." He turned then, slowly, as if seeing her for the first time. There was something frightening in his eyes, not madness exactly, but conviction so deep it had drowned all reason. "I have brought you here to save your soul," he said quietly. "Do not let it be lost among the heathen." Grace couldn't bear it. She ran out into the desert light, tears burning her face. Beyond the edge of town, smoke rose against the horizon. She followed it, half in fear, half in defiance, until the ground turned to blackened ash. There, among the wreckage of what must have been a small camp, she saw something glinting in the dirt, a silver pendant shaped like an eagle. She picked it up, brushing off the soot. It wasn't Apache. It was a soldier's charm. Her stomach knotted. The truth was clearer now than ever. Someone wanted war, and her father's voice was their weapon. As the wind swept over the plain, she turned back toward redemption, clutching the pendant tight in her palm. Somewhere beyond the ridge, she thought she saw movement, a shadow too tall to be a man watching her from afar. Tawa. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he raised a hand, not in greeting but in warning, and vanished again into the endless burning desert. The night after the raid, redemption lay in uneasy silence. No one spoke of what had happened, but the air carried it anyway. Thick, sour, unspoken. Grace sat by the chapel window, the silver pendant still in her hand. She had turned it over 100 times, tracing the shape of the eagle engraved into its face, a soldier's charm. Proof that the ones who'd attacked the ranch were not Apache at all. Proof that her father's crusade was built on a lie. Outside, the moon bled pale light over the rooftops. The desert beyond looked endless, a sea of white sand and shadow. Somewhere out there, Tawa watched and waited. She could feel him like a heartbeat just beneath the earth. Her father was inside, pacing the floor again. Every few steps he muttered a line of scripture, as if trying to stitch the world back together with words alone. When he noticed her, he stopped. You've been quiet, Grace. She looked up from the pendant. I'm thinking. About what? About truth, he smiled, weary and small. Truth is simple. It's written plain in the Word of God. Grace stood. Then why do your sermons sound like war? The question struck him harder than a slap. For a moment he simply stared, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Then his voice hardened. I preach what must be heard, he said. This land is cursed with sin. If we do not cleanse it, it will consume us. Is that what happened to the ranchers? His jaw clenched. You don't understand. I understand enough, she said. Those men died for something they didn't do, and you let them believe it. Her father turned away, his shoulders trembling. You think I wanted this? He whispered. You think I sleep easy knowing men bled under the cross I carry? He gripped the pulpit, knuckles white. I am trying to keep this town alive. If that means war, then so be it. Grace stepped forward, voice breaking. War with who, Father? With ghosts? He didn't answer. For a long moment they stood in the heavy dark, preacher and daughter, faith and doubt, bound together by love that no longer spoke the same language. Finally, Grace turned toward the door. If truth is simple, she said softly, then I'm going to find it myself. The desert met her like a wall of silence. She walked past the edge of the town, past the dying mesquite trees following the dry riverbed where she had met Tawa before. The stars burned hard and cold above her. After an hour, she heard a voice, low, steady, calling her name. He stepped from the shadows like a memory made real. You shouldn't have come, Tawa said. I had to, she answered. They're blaming your people for something you didn't do. His face remained unreadable. They always do. I can prove it, she said, holding out the pendant. This was left at the burned camp. A soldier's token. Tawa took it, turning it between his fingers. The faint firelight caught on the metal. Army men, he said at last. They bring guns to both sides. They sell fear for gold. Grace swallowed hard. Then we have to tell them. My father, the sheriff. They have to know. Tawa's gaze met hers, steady and sad. They will not hear you. Their hearts are already full of war. Then what should I do? He hesitated, then stepped closer. When truth walks into fire, it must choose whether to burn or to light the way. Grace didn't fully understand, but the words lodged deep in her chest. She looked back toward the town, a faint cluster of lights swallowed by the dark. I can't just let them destroy each other, she said. You cannot stop what has already begun, he said quietly, but you can choose who you stand beside when the storm comes. For a long moment, the wind was the only sound between them. Then Tawa turned, disappearing once more into the desert's wide silence. Grace stood there, the night pressing close, her heart pounding with the weight of what she had just heard. When she finally walked back toward redemption, she knew she could never again belong fully to her father's world, nor to his God. The dawn came quiet, but the peace was a lie. When Grace opened her eyes, the first thing she heard was shouting, rough voices, boots striking wood, the sound of a door being kicked open. Through the thin walls of the chapel house, she could make out her father's voice rising above the others. They were seen near the ridge, he thundered. The heathen have gathered for war. This time we strike before they do. The mob outside roared in agreement. Grace dressed quickly, her heart pounding. Through the window, she saw men mounting horses, rifles gleaming in the morning light. The air smelled of smoke and something worse, that hot, fevered scent that always came before blood. She stepped outside. Father! He turned, eyes bright with conviction and exhaustion. Stay inside, Grace. This isn't your burden. It's everyone's burden if it's wrong, she said, her voice shaking. You don't know who you're fighting. The men who burned the ranch weren't Apache. The crowd went still. Her words hung there, trembling. Her father's face hardened. You've been listening to the devil's whispers again. Grace's throat tightened. I've been listening to the truth. Truth? His voice rose, a preacher's fury breaking through. You think some savage filled your head with truth? You think he knows God better than I? I think he knows mercy better than you do, she said quietly. The words cut deeper than she meant them to. For a heartbeat, she thought he might strike her. Instead, he turned away, jaw tight. Get her out of here, he told the blacksmith. She's lost her senses. Grace didn't wait to be dragged. She turned and ran, past the stables, past the outskirts of town, until her lungs burned and the dust turned to open desert. The sun was high when she reached the ridge. Her skirt was torn, her bonnet long gone, her breath raw from running. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't go back. She followed the dry creek until it widened into the basin where she had first met Tawa. The spring still glimmered faintly, a mirror in the rock. He was already there. Tawa stood by the water, silent, as though he had known she would come. His expression didn't change when he saw her, but something in his eyes softened. "You left them," he said. "I had to," she whispered. "They're going to attack your people." He nodded slowly. "Yes, I know. You knew? My scouts saw them right out at dawn. They bring fire. My people will not run this time." Grace stepped closer, desperate. "Then let me warn them. Let me help." Tawa looked at her for a long moment, not as a settler's daughter, not as an outsider, but as something in between. "If you come with me, there is no going back," he said. "Your father will call you enemy." Grace swallowed. "Then so be it." He studied her face, searching for hesitation. There was none. Finally, he nodded once. "Then you ride with me." He led her to a narrow path hidden behind the ridge. 2 horses waited, one of them smaller, pale and restless. She climbed onto it, her hands trembling as she took the reins. "Stay close," Tawa said. "The desert does not forgive the careless." They rode hard across the flats, wind whipping their hair, the sun burning their backs. Grace had never ridden so far so fast, and yet she felt freer than she ever had in her life. As the land opened before them, endless, fierce, alive, she realized that the line between sin and salvation had never been as clear as her father claimed. They reached a canyon by dusk, red cliffs rising on either side. Fires flickered ahead in the Apache camp. Women and children watched silently as Tawa dismounted. Grace followed, her heart thundering. Whispers rippled through the camp. Some stared at her with suspicion, others with pity. Tawa raised a hand. "She comes in peace," he said in his own tongue. A tall, older woman stepped forward, her face lined with wisdom and weariness. "Then may she prove it," she said. Grace bowed her head. "If it's proof you need, I'll find it," she said softly. "But please, and don't fight tonight. Not until I make them see the truth." The woman regarded her for a long time, then nodded once. Tawa looked at Grace, the firelight catching his eyes. "You cannot save both sides," he said quietly. "Maybe not," she answered. "But I have to try." The desert wind carried sound for miles, the cry of hawks, the rustle of dry grass, the faint, distant thunder of hooves. By the time night fell over Apache Ridge, word had already reached Redemption. The preacher's daughter had gone. Reverend Nathaniel Cole stood in the doorway of the chapel, staring out into the black horizon. A lantern burned behind him, casting long shadows across the pews. He had been silent for hours, Bible clutched tight in his trembling hands. When the blacksmith approached, hat in hand, he hesitated before speaking. "Reverend, the men think she's gone with them Apaches. They saw 2 riders heading toward the ridge before dusk." For a long moment, the preacher didn't move. Then slowly he turned his head. His eyes no longer looked like a man's. They burned with something too bright, too wild. "Gone with them?" He repeated softly, almost to himself. "No, my Grace would not betray her father. Not her God." The blacksmith swallowed. "Maybe she didn't mean to. But you know how folks'll talk?" The preacher struck him across the face. It wasn't rage. It was revelation. "She's been taken," he said, voice trembling with conviction. "The heathen have stolen her soul, and the Lord has chosen me to bring her back." He strode past the blacksmith, calling to the men who still lingered near the saloon. "Gather your horses! We ride at dawn." The sheriff tried to speak reason, but his words died in the fire of the preacher's gaze. "If you follow me," Nathaniel said, "you ride not for vengeance, but for deliverance." "God himself commands it," the crowd murmured. Uncertain, but fear and faith make easy companions, and by sunrise, the posse was ready once more. In the canyon beyond the ridge, Grace woke to the soft glow of dawn. The Apache camp stirred quietly, fires smoldering, children whispering, women grinding maize between stones. The air was thick with smoke and morning chill. Tawa stood at the edge of the camp watching the horizon. His stance was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Grace joined him, pulling her shawl close. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Your father leads them." She closed her eyes. She had known it, but hearing it aloud still hurt like a wound reopened. He won't stop, she whispered. He thinks he's doing God's work. Tawa turned to her. And what do you think? She hesitated. I think he's forgotten who God is. He nodded once. Fear does that to men. They stood in silence for a long moment, the desert wind tugging at their clothes. Grace looked at him, at the calm strength in his face, the way he carried the weight of his people without bitterness. Will you fight? She asked. If they force me to, he said, but not before. Blood spills fast and it never stops where men think it will. Grace looked toward the rising sun. Somewhere beyond those cliffs, her father was riding closer with fire in his heart. She thought of the sermons he'd preached, the hymns he'd sung, the hands that had once blessed her hair in prayer. Now those same hands would carry a rifle. I can still try to reach him, she said. If he sees me, if he hears me, maybe he'll stop. Tawa's gaze softened. You believe words can stop a storm? Maybe not, she said. But storms still hear thunder. He almost smiled at that. Then you will have your chance. When he comes, I will not raise my hand first. She touched his arm, a small human gesture amid the weight of what was coming. Thank you, she said. Do not thank me, he replied. Pray instead that your father remembers who he was before the fire. By the time the sun reached its peak, dust clouds were already rising in the distance, a long, trembling line of riders cresting the horizon. Grace's heart pounded. The sound of hooves grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like war drums. Beside her, Tawa drew a long breath and said almost to himself, The storm has come. And from the front of that storm rode her father, his black coat whipping behind him, his eyes fixed on the fire ahead, and the daughter who had become his enemy. The canyon held its breath. Sunlight burned white across the rocks, throwing long shadows that looked like ghosts reaching for the living. The Apache camp was quiet, too quiet. Warriors waited behind stone ledges, bows ready, faces unreadable. Women gathered the children near the caves, their eyes wide with fear they didn't speak aloud. Grace stood at the center of it all, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. The dust cloud on the horizon grew larger, darker, the sound of hoofbeats swelling until it filled the world. Then, through the shimmering haze, the riders came. At their head rode her father, tall in the saddle, his black coat flaring behind him like wings of shadow. In one hand he carried a rifle, in the other, his Bible. The sight of him made Grace's knees go weak. He reined his horse at the edge of the canyon and raised his hand. The posse spread out behind him, rifles trained on the camp below. Grace, he called, his voice carrying across the rocks. Come away from there. Her throat tightened. Father, please. He cut her off, pointing the rifle toward the canyon floor. Step aside. These people have taken you from me. I'll see them judged before the day is done. They didn't take me, she shouted back. I came on my own. Murmurs rippled through the men behind him. The preacher's jaw clenched. You don't know what you're saying. The devil twists the tongues of the weak. Grace's voice broke, but she forced the words out anyway. The only devil here is the hate that's blinded you. A stir ran through the camp. Tawa stepped forward from the shadows, tall and calm, unarmed except for the long knife at his belt. His presence silenced both sides. He looked up at the preacher, meeting his gaze without fear. No one here seeks war, he said in a deep, steady voice. But if you bring it, the desert will remember your blood. The preacher's hands shook, and not from fear, but from fury. You speak of memory, savage? Then remember this. He raised his rifle. Grace screamed, No! Before he could fire, a shot cracked the air, not from him, but from one of the men behind him. The bullet struck a rock near Tawa's feet, spraying dust. The moment shattered. In an instant, the canyon erupted. Gunfire thundered from both sides, echoing off the stone walls. Horses reared, men shouted, arrows hissed through the air. Smoke filled the canyon like a storm cloud. Grace dropped to the ground as bullets sang past. She crawled toward her father, calling his name. But he didn't hear her, or wouldn't. He had dismounted, firing wildly, his face contorted in something beyond rage, beyond reason. Through the chaos, Tawa moved, a shadow between gunfire and dust. He closed the distance in moments, knocking the rifle from the preacher's hands with a blow that sent it spinning into the sand. The two men faced each other, preacher and warrior. Faith and fury, while the battle raged around them. Tawa spoke first. You would kill your own blood for a lie. My daughter's soul is already dead, the preacher spat. You took her. I took nothing, Tawa said. You gave her away to fear. The preacher drew a knife, trembling with exhaustion. Then fear will finish what you began. He lunged, but Tawa caught his arm, twisting it aside. The knife clattered to the ground. For a heartbeat they struggled, their faces inches apart, two men bound by the same fire, burning for different gods. Then Grace was there, throwing herself between them. Stop, she cried, her voice echoing through the canyon. Please, no more. Both men froze. The sound of gunfire faltered, the echo fading into the wind. Dust settled slowly, revealing the cost. Bodies scattered, the ground dark with blood. Grace looked from one to the other, tears streaking the dirt on her face. Father, look around you, she whispered. Is this God's will? Is this what he wanted from you? For the first time, the preacher's eyes softened. His hand fell limp at his side. He looked down at the dead men, at the smoke curling upward toward the merciless sun. I only wanted to save you, he said hoarsely. Grace stepped closer, resting a trembling hand on his arm. Then save me now. Lay down your hate. The silence that followed was deeper than prayer. Finally, the preacher sank to his knees, the Bible slipping from his grasp, pages fluttering in the wind. Lord, he whispered, forgive me. I mistook my voice for yours, and the desert for once said nothing back. When the last echo of gunfire died, the canyon fell still. The air hung heavy with the scent of dust and blood and the sharp tang of gunpowder. The sun, which had burned so mercilessly through the fight, seemed to dim as clouds drifted across it, softening the light to a muted gold. Grace knelt beside her father. He was breathing, but his strength was gone. The black coat that had once made him look invincible now clung to him like a shroud. Around them, the men of redemption were laying down their weapons, dazed, uncertain what they had just become. The Apache stood silent among the rocks, grim, watchful, but no longer reaching for their bows. The battle had ended not in victory but exhaustion. Tawa crossed the field slowly, his tall shadow stretching across the sand. He looked down at the preacher and then at Grace. He will live, he said quietly. The earth has taken enough. Grace nodded, tears streaking her face. It should never have come to this. Tawa's gaze swept over the canyon, the bodies, the shattered remnants of rifles and arrows. The desert remembers everything, he said. But even it forgets in time. The preacher stirred. His eyes fluttered open, glassy with shock. Grace, he whispered. She caught his hand. I'm here. I saw fire in their eyes. I thought it was hell itself. It wasn't, she said softly. It was us. He closed his eyes again, a long breath leaving him. For the first time since she could remember, he looked small. Just a man, not a messenger. By nightfall, the wounded were tended, the dead laid in rows beneath the cliffs. Grace helped wherever she could, bandaging, fetching water, speaking softly to men on both sides who would never again lift a weapon. Her hands were raw, her dress torn, but she moved with purpose. The work steadied her. The people of redemption and the Apache buried their dead together. No one spoke of victory. The desert wind carried the ashes into the night, scattering them over the ridge that had seen too much blood. Later, when the fires burned low, Tawa found Grace sitting apart on a rise above the camp. The stars stretched endless overhead, sharp and cold. You will not stay, he said, not as a question. She shook her head. My place is between worlds now. Maybe that's where I belong. Tawa studied her for a long moment. Then remember what you've seen here, tell them. The next time men speak of enemies, make them remember the cost. I will, she said. He nodded once. Then go with peace. He turned back toward the camp, his tall figure blending with the darkness until only the faint sound of his footsteps remained. When dawn came again, pale and uncertain, Grace and her father began the slow ride home. Neither spoke. The land stretched endless before them, scarred yet alive. At the edge of the ridge, Grace looked back one last time. Smoke rose faintly from the canyon, curling like a prayer into the brightening sky. She thought of the people they'd left behind, of Tawa's quiet strength, of the graves marked by stones instead of crosses. She thought of how much the desert could hold without ever giving judgment. Her father rode beside her, silent, his Bible closed and resting in his lap. The man who had once thundered from the pulpit now looked lost in his own thoughts. At last he spoke. Do you think there's forgiveness for me? Grace met his eyes. I think forgiveness is the only thing that ever makes the world new again. He nodded, his face breaking into something halfway between a sob and a smile. Then maybe there's hope. They rode on, the wind rising behind them, carrying the smell of dust and sage, the scent of a land forever changed but still enduring. And somewhere beyond the horizon, where the desert met the sky, the giant of Apache Ridge watched the sun climb and turned his face toward a morning that, for the first time in a long while, felt like mercy.